Hello and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm Edgar Wiggins, your host for this program that is dedicated to providing you with practical and useful information regarding mental health and related issues. On average in this country, a person dies by suicide every 11.7 minutes. According to the American Association of Suicidology, each person who dies by suicide leaves behind a minimum of 6 individuals who may be profoundly affected by this death. That's approximately 269,000 survivors each year. From 1992 to 2016, there are currently 5.2 million living suicide survivors in the United States. Here to discuss this very important issue are two social workers. I want to introduce the viewing audience to Amanda Gano and Nicole Jones. Both are suicide survivors, and they're here really to talk about the impact that this loss has had on their life and how it really has shaped their career choice and their willingness to work with people in suicide prevention now. So we're going to start out with Amanda. Amanda, can you tell us about your suicide loss, when it happened, how it affected you?
So I lost my dad at the age, I was 15 years old, to suicide, and I was a freshman at Hammond High School at the time. I had no clue that my dad was struggling with a mental health disorder. Come to find out, he was struggling with bipolar and alcohol and substance use problems. And he was struggling a lot, and my family really swept a lot of the problems under the rug. And he ultimately took his life. The pain just got too unbearable for him, and left behind a lot of grief for myself as a 15-year-old.
How were you told?
So I had the opportunity to find out through my stepfather, and the Howard County Police Department did a great job and passed on the news to him instead of myself. My dad was supposed to be picking my sister up from school that day, never showed up, and we began the search for him, calling his cell phone, calling his work, his house. He hadn't shown for work that day. He wasn't answering any of his other devices, and I continued to call the house over and over again until a police officer answered the phone. And the police officer knew I was a child and asked to speak to an adult, and I knew in that moment my dad was gone. I knew something bad had happened to him. I just didn't know it was suicide. I accidentally found out it was suicide through a friend, and who was told by her mom through my mom, and had found out that way a couple hours after he had died.
Do you have a sense in terms of how that affected you then as a teenager, learning that your father had died by his own hand?
It was numbing. I think you don't know a lot about suicide at 15 years old. You go through your mental health classes your freshman year. You go through that whole week of suicide prevention and what to do and what to say if somebody is struggling. And I had gone through that about a week before my dad had died. I had learned what the warning signs were of suicide. I had learned what to do, and I didn't know he was struggling. I had actually heard my dad say a week before he died that he wanted to kill himself. And I didn't do anything because I was scared. So it was a lot of emotions. It was numbing. It was a lot of guilt because I hadn't done anything that week prior, and shameful because I didn't know anybody else who was a survivor of suicide. Nobody talked about suicide. So it was tough for a while.
Thank you. Nicole, can you tell us about your suicide loss?
I lost my cousin, Tony Harrison, to suicide. And I come from a really large and supportive family. My father is the youngest of 10 siblings, so our family is really close. And as a family, we knew that he tended to have depressive symptoms. He lost a child. He and his wife lost a child many years ago. And we knew that he would get depressed and it would get worse when he drank. But as a family, we never ever imagined that he would take his own life. And at the time, I was in the field of social work, and I worked with veterans who were on inpatient psych units and who often complained of or, experienced suicidal ideation. And so it was something I was used to assessing for, but when it was someone that I cared about, I really didn't see that opportunity to, that they would take their own life. And so on one particular night, our family, we were all together, hanging out, and everyone was enjoying themselves. A few people had drinks, and so he was drinking. And he had mentioned that he was upset, and a couple of family members, just said, it'll be okay, everything's gonna be okay. And would, pat him on the back and just, trying to comfort him because we just didn't realize that was the risk. And so the next morning we found out that he did take his life. One of the things that I found very powerful is that as a family, we also didn't know that he and his wife both had guns in the home. Had we known that, I think it would have made a difference, but we didn't, because I don't think people, as Amanda mentioned, really open up about suicide. And so when he was saying to his family or certain members that he was depressed and that he was tired of living this way, I don't think that we really understood that he was mentioning that he was thinking about suicide. And so as a family, we were devastated because that never happened in our family before. And for me, as a social worker, I had some of those same emotions of how could I not see this? Because as a professional, I know those signs, those symptoms when I'm working with a patient. But when you see that in someone you care about, it's really hard to identify that risk and to ask that question.
How did you find out?
I got a call. Actually, I wasn't with the family that night. They were all together, but I got a call in the middle of the night that he had taken his life. He had shot himself. And so I went over to be with the family, and it was really devastating because I think everyone had just seen him hours before. Some of the things that we found out after his death that I think happens in a lot of families is information comes forward after. But he had a good friend that also was depressed and thinking about suicide, and they considered a pact. But he didn't share that with my cousin's family or his wife or anyone because I think they were both in a bad space. But when he found out that my cousin shot himself, I'm sure it was really devastating because he didn't take his life, which we're glad that he didn't, but I know that that's really hurtful too, having made that pact and changed his mind, which we're very glad for. And he can tell his story and maybe save other lives.
Okay, so you were 15.
Mm-hmm.
You were an adult practicing social work at the time of your loss. Let's start with you. As a 15-year-old, how do you think that really affected you? And do you see any relationship between that and your career choice to become a social worker? But not just to become a social worker, to become a social worker that works in crisis intervention and suicide prevention.
Absolutely. My dad died in May, and by the fall, my mom had enrolled me in group counseling for teens and children who had lost a loved one. Not necessarily to suicide. Every youth in the counseling session had lost, a parent to cancer or a sibling to cancer or, accidental death, not suicide. So I was the only one. And you would have to tell your story of what had happened. So here I am, a 15-year-old, telling that I'd lost my dad, Dale Bruce, to suicide. A lot of the kids were shocked. And at the end of however long the counseling was, a girl approached me and said, "Thank you for sharing your story." Her cousin had died by cystic fibrosis, and she had been considering suicide. And my story prevented her from taking her life. So at that point, I knew that this was an avenue I wanted to go towards. I just didn't think I would do it as a paid profession. I always assumed I would just do this volunteer base because I never wanted to lose my passion for helping people. But people like Nicole, I've known Nicole forever, and other people within the field encouraged me to go to school for social work, go to school to help people, and continue on this fight to reduce that stigma.
So it's interesting though, because here you are in a loss group with other teenagers. Your experience of loss is very different than the other members.
Absolutely.
When you told your story, what was your sense of the reception that you got talking about suicide as opposed to cancer or accidental death or whatever?
I think a lot of the kids were shocked. I think some didn't understand because they were too young to understand what suicide was. Thank goodness the social worker was amazing and had a lot of experience with suicide, and she let me freely talk about my dad's loss. And I think it resonated with a lot of others, just like the girl who told me that I saved her life. It was an option for her, and me talking about my dad helped her not want to also die by suicide.
And how did that impact you?
We're here today. I'm
Okay.
alive. I'm healthy. I have a great family, and I'm helping other people. I do a lot of prevention work and postvention with supporting survivors of suicide, and I think I'm pretty good at what I do, and I make a difference. And I'm in a good place because of what had happened to my dad, it sounds crazy, but I think my dad's death happened for a reason, because I'm now able to help others and support people a lot differently than a lot of survivors are able to do. I don't think a lot of us are the norm to be able to do this as a profession day in and day out.
And you, Nicole, you were practicing social worker when you lost your family member. How has that changed the way that you do your work, or has it?
It has. As I said, I was a social worker before my loss, but when we lost Tony to suicide, it really became my mission. I met Amanda at a Out of Darkness walk through American Foundation for Suicide Prevention as a part of my healing, as a part of my grief process. And then I realized that if I didn't see the signs and symptoms in someone that I cared about, that it would be impossible, especially at the same time the VA was unveiling their suicide prevention program. And I recognized that if I didn't see it in someone I cared about, it would be hard for our veterans to see it in their battle buddies, but as well as their family members to see it in them. And so I really wanted to be part of that mission. And I think it was maybe a couple of years after my loss, I actually applied for a position being a suicide prevention coordinator with the Department of Veteran Affairs. And I've been in that position now for 10 years. And I feel like Amanda, the same. I feel like this unfortunate tragedy happens. It's like a club that you don't want to be in, but once you're in, you feel a responsibility to share the information so that other people don't miss the signs and the symptoms, so that they can help their loved ones.
Well, that's a good place for us to stop. We're going to talk more about this when we come back for our break, but we're going to stop there for right now. We'll be back.
This here is Lizzie, and something's not right. For Lizzie has thoughts to take her own life. She feels sad, she feels lonely, that the world is unfair. But what she seems to not notice is that there are people who care. Her friends and her family, they start to see signs. For Lizzie looks hopeless, anything but fine. Her moods seem to change in the blink of an eye. One minute she's smiling, the next one she cries. What people fail to realize is that Lizzie has fear. Why does she feel the world would be better if she wasn't here? Lizzie's friends and her family decide to intervene. They realize that her situation was more serious than it seemed. It was then that they made a call that would keep her alive, 1-800-273-8255. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline helped Lizzie get on track. They assist all people, young and old, and help them get their lives back. Because of those around her, Lizzie made it out okay. She got the help she needed and inspires people every day. If you were in this place, you'd want someone to catch your fall. So if you see someone in trouble, tell someone, make the call.
Welcome back to Mental Health Matters, where today we are joined by Amanda Gano and Nicole Jones, both of whom are not only suicide loss survivors, but they also are social workers who work in the field of crisis intervention and suicide prevention. Before the break, we were talking about how your losses really impacted not only your life, but also your career choice, and also have, I think, had made some difference in terms of how you approach the issue of suicide prevention, doing assessments and so on. So let's kind of pick up where we left off there. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think my dad's death, it's really empowered me to go towards this field and be the best I can be, helping others who are contemplating suicide and who have lost somebody to suicide. And a big area of my interest is postvention work, so working with survivors of suicide loss. I run the Survivor Suicide Loss Support Group at Grassroots Crisis Intervention Center, and then I do a lot of educational training around what it's like to be a survivor. And I think my dad's loss has really shaped me to be able to speak to this from an actual personal level and have a lot of quality in my trainings and expertise, where a lot of trainers who train on suicide prevention, it's hard to connect if you've never had that type of loss. One thing we learn when we're going through social work school is, to be empathetic towards our clients. And I think that's challenging for a survivor of suicide. Too much empathy for a survivor, you don't understand what they're going through. But for me, I know exactly what they're going through. I understand the feelings that they're having, the trauma that they're experiencing after the loss of their loved one, and I'm able to connect with them, I think, on a different level than a lot of my colleagues are. And I think that's what sets me aside and makes my passion grow a little bit more for this field.
Okay. And how about you, Nicole?
Well, for me, it was a new perspective because, as I said, I was used to working with veterans who had suicide loss. But for me, it was, who were suicidal. And for me, having that loss in my own family opened me up to the risk of future suicidal thoughts or behaviors from inside our family. And so we really had an open discussion as a family about depression, anxiety, substance use, and so it really kind of opened up conversations, which I thought was really powerful because after a loss, sometimes people they clam up, they don't talk about the suicide as the loss. I've even met a family where someone shared that their parents talked about their siblings' loss and said that it was a heart attack instead of a suicide. And so really just having an open discussion with the young people in our family and just being open about suicide was important as a family. For me, the other part, as a clinician, it helped me to normalize suicide more, to help our veterans and anyone that I talk to about suicide feel okay with acknowledging that they had suicidal thoughts. To share a statistic like millions of people think about suicide, it helps someone say, you know what, I'm not by myself. And that this is a common thought and that I can seek help for it. And so I thought that was really what grew in me, kind of like you said, empathy, but also learning how to communicate openly about it so that people will feel comfortable.
Okay, so my question, one of the first things that jumps out at me, having done this work for a long time, as you two know, is the issue of stigma. There's a huge amount of stigma that is associated with mental illness, and there's a huge amount of stigma that is associated with suicide. Your example really made me think about the many times over the years that people have lied about suicide death. So it was a heart attack or it was something else when in fact it was suicide. What's been your experience, the two of you, in terms of dealing with the stigma related to the issue of suicide and suicide loss?
Well, sure. For me, I actually learned a lot as well when I did work as a volunteer with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I realized that that all suicide loss is not the same, and that I really actually learned something. I know this happened years ago, but even the words committed suicide.
Right.
You know, I learned from a survivor who lost a child, and it was just that she felt strongly about that and educated me, and it was something I never repeated, because for her those words meant something so powerful, and that she didn't want it associated with the death of her loved one. And I got that, and so I really shared that with people as I did education, to kind of change the storyline that it's no different than having diabetes or cancer. And if you had diabetes or cancer, you would certainly seek medical attention. And so I try to parallel that with suicidal thoughts and the risk for suicide.
And so now, and one of the things that we know is important when discussing suicide is language. And now what seems to be appropriate is died by suicide as opposed to committed. And I think that's an important thing to know. It's one of those nuances that can help someone be more comfortable in terms of disclosing that loss.
And I'm the same way. Any training that I do, I open up, one of the first things I talk about is the language and how important it is. Especially, I do a lot of training at the School of Social Work with new or about to be social workers, about how important that language can perpetuate that stigma, and it can be very, very harmful to not only survivors like myself and Nicole, but to people seeking help. Because if they think that them dying by suicide is a sin, you know, it could be really, really harmful to their recovery process. And I always think about Kevin Hines, and he always says, it's okay not to be okay, but it's not okay to do it alone, to ask for help or be alone in your recovery process. And I always think about how important that is, because that stigma can prevent that recovery process for somebody. And that's a big push for me with my education, is sharing my dad's story, that he did not have to go down the path if he would have sought that help. But unfortunately, 18 years ago, seeking mental health treatment, it wasn't talked about. It was swept under the rug, like I said, and I don't think a lot of our practitioners and our medical staff had the proper training to really support somebody in his position at that time.
One of the other things that I've found is that not only language, but also there are a number of myths about suicide. I was recently teaching a class of police officers, and I asked a question about why do people die by suicide. And one of the officers was very, very emotional and stood up and said, it's because they're selfish and they don't think about anybody else but themselves. And so that's a myth that's out there, and the research, the actual objective research, says something very, very different.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the one thing I like to always talk about as well with our veterans, because it isn't that they're being selfish, it's that they feel, most likely they feel as though they're a burden to their family.
Exactly.
And that by eliminating their life, their existence, they're feeling as though they're helping their family. And that's one of the things I really try to get across to the families. So, because when they talk about suicide, if they believe it's something selfish that their loved one is doing to hurt them, they're not going to have the right mindset to help them get help as well. And so I really talk a lot about that. The other thing, and Amanda mentioned it, one of the things that I believe is so important is for healthcare providers to be required to have suicide prevention education. And that's something that I think I read an article from a study that looked at how many states require it, and only 10 require healthcare. I think it's a specific type of healthcare provider, social workers, to have the training, but only 3 require nurses, doctors, and social workers. So 3 states out of our entire country require this, when there's upwards of 45,000 people dying by suicide each year. So we need to really talk about preparing our healthcare providers to really see suicide risk so that they can make an intervention.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I've found from personal experience, I had cataract surgery a year ago, and as they were preparing me for surgery, one of the nurses came up and asked me, if I had suicidal thoughts. And I thought, this is interesting, especially given that I'm about to have cataract surgery. I mean, it wasn't like I was going for something else. So I kind of looked at her and paused and really tried to get a sense of, oh, well, we're required to ask that question of everyone. And I said, oh, good. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Because, that's the field I'm in. So there is some movement, but I still think that, it can be very, very challenging for folks. One of the questions that I would be irresponsible if I didn't ask, what have been the biggest challenges in your work?
It's a tough question. It's very, I think, lengthy. I think professionally, as we've been talking about, there's so much stigma associated with suicide. I think that's a huge hurdle because while we've made so many strides since my dad passed away, there's just so much work that needs to be done in our community. And we at Grassroots really feel that because we experience people with suicidal thoughts every day. We hear their stories. We go out with our mobile crisis team on suicide death calls, supporting those survivors, and there's not always the connection or support from the community like it should be. But I think on a personal level, while I probably appear really strong in what I do, there's an emotional factor to this. I mean, losing your dad at 15 years old is a tough thing to go through, and it's something that I go through all the time, getting married, having kids. There's different layers that I experienced throughout my adulthood now with his death, but it's sometimes tough to hear those stories of, man, I know exactly where you're at and I wish I could have helped your loved one. And that's tough sometimes.
Nicole?
Yeah. I was going to say that's a good point that Amanda makes. Self-care is really critical because, as she mentioned, hearing people at their lowest moments, it can be really difficult. So for me, self-care is really important. The other thing that I take away from this job is that suicide is a moment in time where someone is thinking about their life, their purpose, their future. And if I can help them be hopeful just for 5 minutes, it can last a day, a month, a year. And every little bit that they reach out for help and they get that support helps to extend their life. And so it's just really instilling hope. So in those moments when they feel weak, that they have people that they can lean on and they know that they matter.
Well, that's a perfect way to end the show today. I appreciate both of you coming in. Crisis intervention, working with people in a suicidal crisis is a moment in time. And sometimes we can do things that make a difference. And I am very grateful to the both of you, not only for the work that you do, which I feel is very important work, but I also am grateful that you have taken what clearly could have been a tragedy and turned it into an opportunity not only for growth, but for your own healing, recovery, and I can't tell you how important the work is that you do. And thank you, for viewing audience, for tuning in again. And remember, if you or someone you know needs help with a behavioral health crisis, you can call Baltimore Crisis Response Incorporated 24 hours a day at 410-433-5175. And remember, your mental health matters to us.